Brian King, and I will be your interviewer for today. I am a journalist. I'm 18 years old, Mtoto, and I'm very glad to have you here. I like to begin all my interviews with an introduction of you, basically, just to know a bit about yourself.
Well, thank you for reaching out. And my name is Maher Nasser. I work in the United Nations Department of Global Communications. I have been working for the United Nations for over 36 years, having started as a local staff in the UN in Gaza in 1987. I also went to schools run by the United Nations uh, for Palestine refugees, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency that operates in the Middle East. So I have been engaged or involved with the UN from a very, very young age.
Thank you so much for that. Well, I would like to know, having like your vast experience, how exactly does the UN Department of Global Communications prioritize and integrate the perspective and needs of children in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals?
I think various organizations of the United Nations system address, of course, the different mandates that they are working with. So UNICEF within the United Nations is the agency that is basically working throughout their operations, the advocacy for children and supporting children's rights, and the providing services to countries where children may be at risk, uh, from vaccinations to other other services that they provide in different countries. However, in our Department of Global Communications, our role is to basically develop information and communication tools and material that we try to make it adaptable to different ages. The first, of course, consideration we have is to make sure that what we produce is not only available in English. So we produce material in the 6 official languages of the organization, plus Kiswahili, plus Hindi and Portuguese. These are 3 additional languages that we provide information in. We have a program called the Creative Community Outreach Initiative, which offers us the opportunity to collaborate with creators in the entertainment industry who produce programs that are targeting or suitable for children. And with those collaborations, we have been able in the last uh, few years to work with them in incorporating the issues that are on the SDG agenda, including sustainability, including gender equality, including uh, life over land, life underwater, all of these different issues in programs. One example of that is a very popular children's program called Thomas the Tank Engine. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a global. It used to be storybooks, but then there's a television program, and they have worked in the relaunch of the season that was in 2014-15 to 15-16 to incorporate elements of what the SDGs are. It's not about saying this is the icon for SDG 1 or SDG 2, but it's about the concepts. How do you talk about the concepts? Concepts of equality, concepts of protecting nature. And that's how we do it. We collaborate with those who are experts in communicating, creating material for children, and we bring in the UN experts who talk about those concepts, and then they make those productions. We also collaborated with Angry Birds, with the Smurfs, and similar programs around the world.
All right. Thank you so much for that. And talking about partnerships, like for example, with the creatives all around the nation to just create child-friendly content, I would also like to ask, in what ways is the UN leveraging partnerships and collaborations to address the unique challenges faced by children, especially in different geographic locations, just in the world with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals?
Of course, in any situation, children are the most vulnerable. Whether it's a natural catastrophe, whether it's the impact of conflict, Children, women, and girls are among the most vulnerable in communities, and there are, of course, prioritization in the delivery of services in the humanitarian situation. The offices of the UN that are actually working directly in that, whether it's the World Food Program, UNICEF, United Nations High Commission for Refugees on the ground, or the Office of the High uh, Emergency Relief Coordinator, OCHA. They basically develop programs with partners. Usually, the partners are on the ground in the countries that where the UN operates. It collaborates with governments, of course, local, national, but also non-governmental organizations. Our principles are basic that in the humanitarian situation, there's a humanitarian imperative. You provide the support and the assistance, regardless of political considerations. The needs of the children, the needs of the vulnerable, the needs of the refugees, the needs of people displaced are what needs to be met. And we appeal to the international community to provide the United Nations with the resources to be able to do that. And the UN, without working with partners on the ground, cannot deliver on its own.
Okay, that's actually pretty beautiful. And you said it yourself that children are the most vulnerable. So I would also want to ask you, how is the UN connecting with young people? How is the UN making sure that young people are being engaged in the development or the achieving of the sustainable development goals, especially in the ones that mostly affect them, education, health, development, and infrastructure?
Now, about 10 years ago, the United Nations created the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, 10 years ago, appointed the first ever Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. So he's a Secretary General's Envoy, very high level designation. And at the time, the first envoy was a young man who was 27 years old. I, in my role in the Department of Global Communications, actually, we created the office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. And that office, last year, the United Nations General Assembly endorsed the creation of a youth office in the UN. So we have gone a long way in the last 2 years. We had the first envoy, Ahmed Al Hindawi, a young man from Jordan. He served for 4 years. Then he left. Then we hired the second Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, Jayahma Vikramanayake, a young woman from Sri Lanka. She was 26 at the time we hired her. She has now ended her term, and now the UN is recruiting an Assistant Secretary General for Youth Affairs that will head the Youth Office. So the Youth Office serves as a way to basically connect with youth organizations around the world, to give a young voice from the UN to young people, but also to listen and organize connections and bring in the voices of youth into the United Nations.
Okay, and now that is pretty interesting because I would also like to ask a two-part question. Number one, noting that the UN does not currently directly engage with children, although it engages mostly with youth, I'd like to know: are there any plans in the future to now start directly involving or like contacting children directly? Maybe even set up an office or an envoy for children. And also, what is the UN doing just to make sure that children who are in conflict areas or in critical areas, like maybe children in drought areas, conflict areas, as I mentioned, how is the UN planning on ensuring that they are not left behind, especially in the implementation of the SDGs?
Maybe just before I come to that question, let me just also come back to the previous question that you had about how do we also connect young people with the SDGs. One of the initiatives that was also launched by the first youth envoy is identifying and designating 17 young people every 2 years that would be called SDG young leaders that support the SDGs all in their own different ways. And these come from all parts of the world. We make very hard effort. We make a hard effort to ensure that they are, first of all, equal in terms of gender, that they also come from all over the world. So from not no region wouldn't be among the 17. And they would be young people who have excelled already in either innovating um, a new method of dealing with oil spills, for example, or a sustainable product in the textile industry, or serving their communities and finding ways to support children and others in terms of food, shelter, and so on. So already they have marked, and then they are serving in that capacity voluntarily as 17 young leaders. So we had for 2 years, and then the second batch, and the second batch, and the second batch. So that's another way for that. In terms of young people and children, I think one has to recognize. I mean, there are different definitions of where children, but through the programs that support education, because everybody assumes that the right place for children is actually at school. That's where you can actually provide them with tools that they need to make a place for themselves in the past, to pursue their passion, to pursue what to gain the tools that they need in today's world, which is education. In terms of advocacy, advocating for the rights of children, defending children, protecting children, we have an agency called UNICEF. UNICEF is dedicated, whose work is basically to advocate for, protect, and find solutions and assistance to children wherever they are. As to your question whether UN will be creating, I have no information about such an intention in any time. It could be something in the future, but at this stage, I think the focus is children are minors, and within that, we ensure that the adults around situations where they are serving and protect and helping children are also equipped with the tools that they need to protect those children and provide the services for them.
All right, that is interesting to hear, and I guess in the future maybe we can wait to hear about that. But just talking about how children can be even involved, the accountability is a big part of involvement, and I guess that's why I want to ask what measures are in place to monitor and evaluate the progress made in achieving the SDGs, especially in relation to children.
Every year since 2016, the United Nations publishes a report called the SDG report, which is based on information collected by the Department of Economic and Social Affairs within the United Nations, that collects that information from UN entities around the world, but also from governments. And we look at where are we in implementing the SDGs. There's another process called the National Voluntary Review, where governments themselves started in 2016 and moving forward. Um, it started with 40 governments coming forward and saying, we want to share our national voluntary review of what we have done and where are we in the trajectory to achieve the SDGs by 2030. So the most recent report, which is the July of 2023, has showed that we are not on track. We have not been on track since 2019, and the COVID pandemic, the climate crisis, rising displacement and conflict have actually pushed more people into poverty than the last 30 years. For the first time since 1990 until 2019, the number of people living in extreme poverty has been coming down. But because of COVID, because of the combined impact of the climate crisis, COVID, and conflict in Russia's invasion of Ukraine and others, rising conflicts in Africa and other parts of the world, we have increased number of people living in extreme poverty. So we have launched a campaign this year, last week, which is we are now in the midpoint for achieving the SDGs. The SDGs were adopted in 2015 to be achieved by 2030. We are exactly in the middle point. So the campaign is at this midpoint. Let's make the analogy with a football game. In a game of football, You play the first half, you are losing. Your team has lost, but you haven't lost the game because at midpoint, at the halftime, you can change things. And the football game or any game in sport, it is actually always won in the second half, not in the first half. You can turn things around. So this is our moment to turn things around. We know where we are. We are about 12% in terms of achieving the SDGs. We need to be at 50%. And that means that leaders, and not only government leaders are, of course, the most important at this stage because they are the ones who put in national plans, provide the resources, remove the obstacles, but also government leaders in education, leaders in private sector, leaders in civil society, leaders in academia, young people, youth, tackling the climate crisis, addressing gender and gender equality, ensuring that decisions we make today are not at the expense of tomorrow. And then we can actually be optimistic about achieving the right rate of progress to get us back on track.
Right, and I loved your analogy about football. I'm just going to build on that. Before the coach has to make these edits or rather changes into the game plan, they have to have data, and that's why we must ask, how is the data collected? I mean, you told us about it's utilized for informed decision making and policy adjustments, but how is it collected? And building on that, we'd also want to know what is the UN doing to address the digital divide among children, SDG 9, and what steps are being taken to ensure that all children have equal access to digital
Mhm.
resources and technologies for educational and even just informational purposes.
If, if you think the SDGs, there are 17 sustainable development goals. And it's not just the 17 that were adopted by member states. There are 169 targets within the 17 SDGs. So under each SDG, there are 9, 10, 11 targets. And there are 232 indicators of achievement. So all of that was actually adopted and approved at the get-go, at the beginning, so that you can do exactly what you asked me about. How do you monitor? Because there are different indicators, so you can collect that information. Governments have been collecting that information. International organizations have been collecting that information. And then every year, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs brings all of this data and starts to look and see where are we. And you will see that when we publish that report, and you can find that report online, you can see that in some areas, in some regions, for example, of the world or some countries, there is progress, but in other countries, there's no progress. One thing that we know for sure, conflict defeats progress. There might be a country, and there are many examples, where they have achieved good progress in education, good progress in reducing poverty, and then a conflict happens. Conflict, then everything goes back. Everything suffers. So this is why one of the core purposes of the United Nations is creating conditions for peace and mediating and building peace, so that we do in parallel with providing sustainable development assistance and advocating and protecting human rights, because that's the other dimension that sometimes lead into conflict. So all of that is, of course, done in a world where things are not perfect. We recognize that. When you happen, for example, conflicts happen, usually they impact one area where the conflict is happening. But when Russia invaded Ukraine, it had a direct impact on the price of food, grains, and the price of petrol, oil, energy. So energy costs went up, food prices went up, combined with the impact of COVID and climate catastrophe and crisis, it increased the number of people displaced, number of people hungry, number of people living in poverty. So this is the world that we live in, and all the time you think you are on a track, and then something comes and pushes you off, and you have to push back. And that requires determination, but also it reinforces the notion that the only and best way for us to deal with the problems today is to work together as a community of nations, and multilateralism is the way that we can do that. So this is how we try to collect that information, detail it, and of course, the UN is not just the building that, I don't know if you can see it because there's cloud behind me on the other side of the East River. The United Nations is also present in most countries. We have a UN country team, and the UN country team that is present works with the governments through the resident coordinator who leads the UN country team, through the representative of UNICEF, the representative of the United Nations Development Program, representative of the World Food Program if they are there, UNIDO, and all of the other agencies that are the World Bank, IMF, all of those organizations. We work hand in hand in the countries themselves. Now, when there is a conflict, we also have peacekeepers. We have more than 100,000 UN peacekeepers that are placed in countries where there's a conflict and trying to maintain the peace. So this is how we, on the overall, try to provide those services and ensure that we get back on track. The Secretary General is advocating, and he is the voice that we have to really point the way for where we need to go. And I think I missed your last question. If you don't want to repeat that.
Actually, I think you answered all the questions I had asked. But I think as I conclude, then I can ask another question that I love to ask. Since here at Mtoto News, we work with children basically, and they always ask, how can we help? So I would ask you, what is the role of children, or rather, how can children help specifically the Department of Global Communications at the UN level?
Mm-hmm. I think education. Education is important. Take care of your education as a child, and then ensure that you build habits that are in line with what we need when you grow up. Be committed to sustainability. I think thinking today, the problem that we are in today is because we have gone through a period when industry is thinking in the bottom line. How do I maximize my profit without paying due attention to long-term benefits to the community? So for over a decade, over a century, we have relied on fossil fuels. Now we recognize that fossil fuels are part of the problem. We need to move to renewables. Children have to really start to themselves think, go into science and find solutions. There are certain things we can change in the way we behave to reduce our impact. Children also can influence their parents. Ask your parents questions about, is that product the most sustainable product? How can we reduce our impact? Can we get clean? And I know that there is a difference, of course, in depending on which country you are living in. And you mentioned, and the question that I think I didn't mention is the digital divide. Of course, we recognize the digital divide exists. But with the modern cell phone technologies, I think it has helped to bring the internet not necessarily at the same speed, not necessarily at the same bandwidth, to almost all parts of the world. So children are actually also now connected in the same way that young people are more connected. How can each child make an impact? I think they have to look at their situation, their own situation. How can their own behavior, but then voice, help us push in the right direction? Because what is happening on the planet is going to impact them for much, much longer than it's going to impact somebody in my age. So they are invested in making sure that their parents, some of them might be leaders in industry or leaders in government, are taking decisions that take their long-term interests into consideration.
Right. That is some beautiful advice right there, Mr. Maher. And as we conclude, I would just love to ask you, is there anything else you would want to add onto the conversation before we finally sum it up?
Thank you very much. It's heartening to actually be interviewed by an 18-year-old. I assume that you will want to be a journalist in the future,
Yeah.
and maybe we will meet at some point. And you are an established journalist, and I'll be happy to give you another interview at the time. I would probably maybe have retired by then, but would still be happy to see you.
Right. I hope to hold you accountable to that one day. But thank you so much for sparing even these 27 minutes, and we are very grateful for that you could be able to join us and answer our questions. But that would conclude our interview for today. Again, very grateful and very happy that you could join us. See you in the next interview, Mr. Maher. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.